Many of the beautiful knitting stitches that you see out there are just a combination of knits and purls. So once you learn the basic techniques of knitting and purling in your projects, well, the next logical thing to do is start incorporating these two basic stitches into your projects to create more interesting stitches. So I want to share some of those with you today. If you're looking for the next thing to do in your knitting journey, maybe you've followed my beginner washcloth pattern, you're really good at garter stitch, you know how to do your knits, you know how to do your purls. These are the stitches that I would try next. Now I should probably start this list off with the stockinette stitch because let's face it, it's a great neck stitch to learn as a new knitter. You'll use it in tons and tons of patterns moving forward, but it's not quite as interesting as some of the others. So let's save the stockinette stitch for later and start this list off with the double moss stitch. I really love this stitch because it has some really great texture, but it still has a very simple repeat. So repeats, if you're super new to this and you haven't heard that term before, a repeat can be in two different directions. You can have stitch repeats and you can have row repeats or round repeats if you're knitting in a round. Sticking with something that has a simple or a shorter repeat, both stitch repeat and row repeat, is generally what I like to recommend first because you get the chance to practice memorizing what your hands and fingers and yarn has to do. So the double moss stitch is really great for that. It has a very simple stitch repeat, a very simple row repeat, but it still has some really great texture to it. Now the double moss stitch is just a combination of knits and purls worked in certain order, and when you do so in a certain way, you get this kind of neat, bumpy, somewhat basket weave, but very attractive texture to your projects. It doesn't like to curl a whole lot. That is something that you will find with some knit stitches. It'll curl a little bit on the bottom, or it might curl a little bit on the sides, but there are a few stitches out there that don't curl as much, and this is one of them. Now along the same lines, you've probably seen the seed stitch. Maybe you didn't know it was called that, but you've recognized this nice, really cool bumpy texture. There's also a really simple stitch repeat and row repeat, so there's nothing complicated that you have to memorize while you're trying out these new skills. And the other cool thing about the seed stitch is that it doesn't curl, like basically at all. It's a lot like the garter stitch in that it lays perfectly flat for your projects. So the seed stitch and the double moss stitch I would generally group in a similar category because they're very similar in how they're knit. So give one or both of these a try. I think you'll definitely find some of these in some of your favorite patterns. You'll definitely find these stitches in patterns on my website as well if you need a little bit of inspiration. Another really fun and interesting stitch pattern that you can try that also has a lot of different variations is a simple basket weave stitch. A basket weave stitch, again, uses knits and purls to create woven basket weave kind of texture, and it makes for very interesting projects that have some really nice drape to them, have a lot of stretch, plus it's really versatile. They look really great with blankets and clothing and scarves and anything else that you can dream up. This basket weave stitch is just a very basic version of what you can do, but it does not end there. There are so many different versions of the basket weave stitch that are wider, longer, have different textures, have different stitches. Really, the sky's the limit, and a basket weave stitch is a must try if you haven't already. Here's a really cool modern example of a basket weave stitch that uses the seed stitch that we already talked about and incorporates that into a basket weave pattern. So when you look at this one, it just has a little bit of an extra pop or wow factor to it because it doesn't look like a basket weave stitch traditionally, but it still looks like a basket weave stitch. Now I have this blanket pattern for free on my website. I'll have that linked in the description below. It's a great project if you want to dive into once you're a little bit further along in your journey on repeats, memorizing and working with longer repeats. Now, while this one is a very basic stitch and it just uses knits and purls, there is a pretty lengthy row repeat. And I don't say that to scare you. It's a very easy stitch to learn, but the additional skill that will come with working with a pattern like this one is you have to keep track of where you are within the row repeat to keep you on track. Now, any stitch list just wouldn't be complete without some kind of ribbing to it. And ribbing is really great with knitting. It's, again, one of those stitches where there are a ton of different variations, so you can take the idea and sort of run with it. The first ribbing that I learned as a new knitter was a 2x2 rib. And that means we have 2 knits followed by 2 purls. 2 knits, 2 purls. And when you repeat that over and over, then you get this beautiful, extremely stretchy ribbing pattern that any knitter toolkit would not be complete without. Ribbing is a foundation for all sorts of projects where you need to have a specific fit in mind. So think about it. Mittens or gloves, you need the ribbing so that it stays nice and tight on your wrist. Hat, you usually have some ribbing down at the bottom so it stays nice and tight around your ears. Or for sweaters or cardigans or anything like that, shirts, tops, you want some ribbing in all of the right places to hold it into place. Maybe around your arms, around the waistband, maybe a little bit around the neckline. And a basic ribbing pattern is at the foundation of all of these. So the 2x2 rib is what I would recommend starting with, but it does not end there, my friend. You can go 1x1 rib, which is just 1 knit, 1 purl, 1 knit, 1 purl. You could do 3x1 rib, which I have in my men's hat. I'll have that linked in the description as well. You can do a 2x1, 2x4, 1x4. I mean, pretty much any type of combination you can think of to make a ribbing. Basically, play around with it, maybe find a couple of stitch patterns that you like and try them first, and then just tinker and have fun with it. And now I do have to swing back to the stockinette stitch because I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't tell you about this stitch, just in case you don't already know about it. The stockinette stitch is like the classic next stitch that you learn as a new knitter once you've mastered the garter stitch. So the garter stitch, remember, is just all knits, every stitch, every row, or all purls, every stitch, every row. And you get this really nice bumpy texture with some great drape, some great stretch, and it doesn't roll or curl anywhere within the pattern. So the stockinette stitch is like the next simplest stitch from the garter stitch. With this one, you're knitting every stitch in one row, and then on the following row, you're purling every stitch. And then you jump back to your knits, then your purls, and your knits, and your purls. And when you do this, you get that beautiful classic stockinette knit stitch look. And although it is one of the most basic stitches out there, it is the most versatile stitch out there, and you will find it a lot in knitting patterns. Sweaters, hats, blankets, pillows. I mean, honestly, any and every type of knitting project you can think of, you could probably knit it with the stockinette stitch. So we have seed stitches, double moss stitches, kind of fitting into the really textured, really nice, fun, and interesting category. We've got the basket weave for maybe a more classic or traditional, but something you can have a modern twist on. We've got some ribbing patterns that are just like your workhorses of all of your knitting projects. They just get the job done. There's tons of different variations, and they're really simple to knit. And then we have our other workhorse, the stockinette stitch, which is just a non-negotiable, one of those stitches you have to learn. So how can you learn these new stitches and incorporate them into something that feels meaningful, right? You can knit swatches if that's your thing. I do that from time to time. I like knitting gauge swatches. I like practicing with different yarns with just little swatches, but it is not for everybody or every situation. Sometimes I don't feel like knitting a swatch and I just want to make something that's useful. In those cases, I like to knit washcloths or dishcloths for my swatches. It's basically just one big square that you make between like 8 inches and 10 inches wide. Will get you a pretty good washcloth. And I do typically like to make these with a 100% cotton yarn because they're washable. durable, they dry easy so they don't, get all funky and weird. And it's generally pretty easy to find cotton yarn at your local yarn store. So here's what I would suggest next. Pick your favorite stitch out of this list and give it a try first. I have written instructions for every single stitch that we talked about here, with the exception of all of the ribbings, because, I don't have a stitch pattern for all of the ribbings, but I do have one for that basic 2x2 rib, which is super functional, and it will more than do the job to teach you about ribbing and how to knit it. So there we have it. Those are my top recommendations for stitches to learn next after you've mastered those knits and purls. Again, check the description below for all of the links to the stitch patterns, the couple patterns that I talked about. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next one.